at a much earlier point, but the whole idea of canon was something that's retroactively imposed upon books at a later time. Books are not written as canon, they say, they become canon. What you see here then is an interesting development in the way canon is conceived of in early Christianity. Canon in the minds of scholars today is not something that originated at all in the first century. It's an idea that came up late and then was imposed on books written for an entire other purpose. Harry Gamble comments on this. He says this, and by the way, this is a stunning quote. Listen to what he says. There is no intimation at all that the early church entertained the idea of Christian scriptures. Therefore, the New Testament, as we think of it, was utterly remote from the minds of the first generation of Christian believers. In other words, in the mind of many scholars today, the Christian canon is, well, not Christian. It's not something Christians would have done in the earliest phase. It's not something that was even on their mind. They were concerned with oral proclamation. The idea of writing things down in authoritative books was completely foreign to the development of early Christianity. Now it is here then that we come to a foundational tenet of modern canonical scholarship. Namely, as we've said, that the New Testament canon was not a natural part of early Christianity and was in one sense forced on it. This is what we might call the extrinsic model of canon, if we're going to give it a name. An extrinsic model of canon is to argue that canon is to some degree a late concept imposed upon books written for another purpose. Now, as we pause here on this idea of an extrinsic model for a moment, it's important to realize something very critical, and that is this. The extrinsic model, the idea that canon is a late ecclesiastical development, is the paradigm through which modern canonical studies is done. Every discipline has a framework. Every discipline has a standard orthodoxy through which they see things. Every discipline has a lens through which it views the evidence. This is that lens in modern canonical studies, the idea that canon is late and retroactively posed upon books. So this lens, this framework then, is not so much something that's proven by the historical evidence, nor even something that scholars often try to prove from the historical evidence. Rather, this in some sense is the starting point for almost all modern canonical scholarship. Now, with that as a framework, let me just draw out two implications of this framework before we dive into it more fully. The first implication, I think, is an obvious one. If you have an extrinsic model framework as you enter into canonical studies, it's going to affect the way you interpret historical evidence. This cannot be avoided. When people with the extrinsic model look at the first century, they hardly ever will acknowledge that books were used as scripture in the first century. Even evidence that seems to suggest such will be dismissed under the rubric that this is way, way too early for a canon. Why? Because canon was a late ecclesiastical development imposed upon books. Therefore, early evidence is regularly dismissed or overlooked because of the framework through which it's seen. There's a second implication. It's this. If the canon is a late development, then it leads scholars to posit a variety of theories of why the church decided to have a canon at all. If there's nothing about the first century that would have led to a canon, then there must be some other later cause. And it's here that we see a variety of scholarly theories pop up. Give you a couple examples. David Dungan, in his book Constantine's Bible, and by the way, just notice the title of that, Constantine's Bible, you can see already where this is going. In his book Constantine's Bible, he pens the origins of the canon on the influence of Greek philosophy and its emphasis on possessing a list of genuine writings that contain true doctrine. And he argues it was Constantine who caused that to happen. According to Dungan, Constantine's power, in one sense, reached its height, and he intruded into the canonical process and made the early church adopt a formal, static canon through what he calls, quote, coercive enforcement. So that's one theory on why the canon happened. Helmut Koester at Harvard University takes another route. He argues, along with Harnack and von Kampenhausen, that the impelling force behind the formation of the canon was Marcion in the 2nd century and his heresies. And by the way, that's a standard paradigm in canonical studies today. Why do we have a canon? According to Koester and Harnack and others, the reason we have a canon is because of the heretic Marcion comes along, causes a problem. The church thinks to themselves, we got to do something about this. And the canon was produced as a response to Marcion in the late 2nd century. Other scholars like Elaine Pagels follow this same path and ultimately lay the canon at the feet of Irenaeus, who they say was simply putting it together to respond to Marcion. Now, theories on this abound. Regardless of the specific raison d'etre for this, the dominant position in critical scholarship today is that the idea of canon was late and not really part of Christianity in its essence. So how should we respond to this particular framework? Are we really to think that nothing at all determined that there would be a canon until the late church? Are we to think there was nothing about earliest Christianity that might have given rise to such a collection? In this second lecture, I want to make an argument. It's simply this. I think there are reasons to think that canon would have been a natural and to some extent inevitable development from first century Christianity. Another way to say it is I think there was a theological mix, or a mix rather, of theological beliefs, doctrines that early Christians held and understood. And this matrix of theological beliefs would have formed the proper soil out of which a new canon could sprout. In other words, what we want to do in this second lecture is argue that the environment of the first century was the perfect environment out of which a new canon would come, not something that would have happened later and then imposed on these books for another purpose. So this is what we might call an intrinsic model of canon. So as opposed to the extrinsic model that suggests it's a late ecclesiastical development, we're going to argue here for an intrinsic model that canon would develop naturally and innately from what was already true of early Christianity and what Christians already believed. So what did Christians already believe that might have led to the development of a canon? Well, I'm going to walk us through three things. As you can see there, if you have the lecture outline for part 2, three beliefs of early Christianity that I think laid the foundation for a new canon, and I think really affirm an intrinsic model as opposed to an extrinsic model. So let's just walk through these one at a time. First, the eschatological nature of early Christianity. The Jews of the Second Temple period, which is really referring to the first century, those Jews were not a settled group. And this is something for us to understand right out of the gate. Despite having returned to the promised land, they still conceived of themselves as, to some extent, still in exile. Yes, they were in the land of Palestine, but they were still oppressed from foreign rulers, Roman government over their heads. Thus, Israel in the first century was in a posture of anticipation, a posture of longing, waiting for God to fulfill his Old Testament promises that he would break in a special way and deliver his people, that God's kingdom would come in a powerful manifestation. That was the longing of first century Jews. They longed for God's redemption. They longed for God's inbreaking of the kingdom. Now, not only is this heightened expectation of a renewed redemptive kingdom evident in the Old Testament, it's also evident in a number of Second Temple texts. And we don't have time to go through these this morning. Everything from Tobit to First Baruch to the Testament of Moses to Second Maccabees to different wisdom literature and Qumran literature all indicate that first century Jews were in a posture of anticipation about God's special inbreaking. In fact, even in the New Testament itself, we can see that Jews were anticipating the kingdom of God coming. Numerous texts bear this out. John 1:41, we read about people looking and longing for the Messiah. Luke 2:38, we're told that people are anticipating the, quote, redemption of Jerusalem. Luke 2:25, people were awaiting the consolation of Israel. Acts 1:6, they were anticipating God restoring the kingdom to Israel. Now, another way to articulate this Second Temple expectation of a future divine inbreaking is simply this. I think this is a very critical way to say it. It's to say that the Jews of this period viewed the story of the Old Testament books as incomplete. Now, we don't really think about this very much. We don't really ask the question, how would a first century Jew have viewed the ending of the Old Testament, if we want to say it like this? Would they have thought it was a complete story? Would they have thought it was finished? It was done? Well, it's clear that this expectation of God's next chapter is evident that first century Jews did not see the Old Testament as a finished story. In fact, when the Old Testament story of Israel was viewed as a whole, it was viewed by first century Jews as something not that was finished, but that was waiting to be finished. N.T. Wright, I think, observes this well when he says, quote, "The great story of the Hebrew Scriptures was therefore inevitably read in the Second Temple period as a story in search of a conclusion." In fact, some scholars have, I think, rightly argued that the Old Testament canon would have actually ended with the book of Chronicles. And we can't go into all the evidence for that, but I happen to believe that's correct, that the structure of the Old Testament canon by the time of the 1st century would have ended with the book of Chronicles. And the book of Chronicles to end the Old Testament canon would have been very telling. Because even though Israel had been brought out of exile back into the promised land, as Ezra and Nehemiah attested, to end the Old Testament canon with Chronicles is basically a way of saying that return out of exile was a physical one, yes, but not a spiritual one. God isn't done with Israel. We're still waiting for our ultimate redemption. In other words, to end the Old Testament canon with Chronicles would have put 1st century Jews in a posture of anticipation that God's Davidic king was still on his way. By the way, that's exactly what Chronicles is about, God's Davidic king, as it focuses on David. This particular posture that of anticipation tells us something very critical about Second Temple Judaism. And with that in mind, we're now in a position to understand the eschatological nature of early Christians, who, by the way, were Jews. Here's the thing about early Christians that was completely unique and really radical, is all those anticipations that we just described in Old Testament and intertestamental expectations for all the Jews, all those anticipations early Christians believe had been realized in the coming of Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, Christians had the radical belief that in Jesus Christ, God had actually done that divine inbreaking into the world of their day. So when we talk about Christians being eschatological here, we're not talking about them believing in the second coming. I know that's usually what's in our head when we think about eschatological. We think, oh, we're talking about the parousia. No. When we're talking about early Christians, the earliest Christians were Jews being eschatological, what we mean is that they had this belief that God had already begun to fulfill all those Old Testament promises about the breaking in of the kingdom in the person of Jesus Christ. Israel's long-awaited redemption had already occurred.
I just want to share a few thoughts on that. Couple of things. Number one, he talked about early on the various model of historical inquiry, and I think what you find with people like Bart Ehrman and these other scholars is they kind of come across as if they're objective, critical scholars, but as this scholar has noted, that your theory of history, your theory of the church, what the church is, what the church was, these theories will influence your historical inquiry. So, for example, Bart Ehrman believed that anything Jewish within the New Testament was not authentic. And the reason is he believed that